Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism, the show that finds anarchism, cooperation, non-domination, mutual aid in your everyday life. I'm your host, Graham Culbertson, and this is another episode in my series on David Graeber's Debt. It is Chapter 10, The Middle Ages. Before I go on, I will say I got a different microphone that I'm hoping is going to give better results, but so far I'm not sure, so if this episode sounds terrible, sorry. The next episode after this one, the debt discussion, is with Eleanor Janega, who kicked this whole series off, and Eleanor and I mostly discussed Europe, which is her specialty, and I think it's also what most of us in the US and Europe think of when we think of the Middle Ages. Knights and kings and wizards and feudalism and quests and grails. I've been working with some medievalists here in the UNC English department, and they've convinced me that this version of the Middle Ages, via Tolkien and Skyrim and The Witcher, has kind of taken over the world. Some huge percentage of the world population escapes into this highly stylized vision of France or England or Germany circa 1107 as their form of relaxation. Graeber, though, wants to decenter that version of the Middle Ages. In fact, although I think of the Middle Ages as a Western idea, coming from Italians in the 14th and 15th century who claimed that they were reviving the great accomplishments of antiquity after 1,000 years of, being in between, Graeber doesn't have that view. So, to me, the Middle Ages means what came in between two great eras of Italian dominance, and that is the era and the location that you'll hear Eleanor and I discuss. Graeber thinks that the Middle Ages is actually a global phenomenon which doesn't describe what was happening in Europe, or what we might call Northwestern Europe, very well. So perhaps, whereas I think of the Middle Ages, and like I said, billions of people probably think of the Middle Ages this way, thanks to video games and Tolkien, as Germanic people in castles with swords, Graeber says the Middle Ages was a real cycle of history in which Germanic people with swords weren't very important. Here's a quote. "For most of us, medieval remains a synonym for superstition, intolerance, and oppression. Yet for most of the Earth's inhabitants, it could only be seen as an extraordinary improvement over the terrors of the axial age." And Eleanor and I did talk about this idea extensively. Moving on with the quote. "One reason for our skewed perception is that we're used to thinking of the Middle Ages as something that happened primarily in Western Europe, in territories that had been little more than border outposts of the Roman Empire to begin with. According to the conventional wisdom, with the collapse of the empire, the cities were largely abandoned and the economy reverted to barter, taking at least 5 centuries to recover. Even for Europe, though, this is based on a series of unquestioned assumptions that, as I've said, crumble the moment one starts seriously poking at them. Chief among them is the idea that the absence of coins means the absence of money. But one need only do the math. Since medieval agriculture was no less efficient than ancient agriculture, in fact it rapidly became a great deal more so, the amount of work required to feed a handful of mounted warriors and clergymen could not possibly have been anything like that required to feed entire cities. However oppressed medieval serfs might have been, their plight was nothing compared with that of their axial age equivalents. Still, the Middle Ages proper are best seen as having begun not in Europe, but in India and China, between 400 and 600 AD, and then sweeping across much of the western half of Eurasia with the advent of Islam. They only really reached Europe 400 years later. Let us begin our story, then, in India." That's the end of the quote. I'll get to India in a second, but let me first explain what Graeber says the Middle Ages are. They aren't a dark time when German knights ruled before the Italians got their act together again. What they actually are is a time in which the grandest imperial civilizations, Chinese, Indian, and Islamic, had to deal with a new set of ideas about the relationship between debt, money, and morality. As Graeber puts it, if the axial age saw the emergence of complementary ideals of commodity markets and universal world religions, the Middle Ages were the period in which these two institutions began to merge. Or, when he's summing up later in the chapter, the Middle Ages were marked by a general move toward abstraction. Real gold and silver ended up largely in churches, monasteries, and temples. Money became virtual again, And at the same time, the tendency everywhere was to set up overarching moral institutions meant to regulate the process and, in particular, to establish certain protections for debtors. All right, end of that quote. Now, as you know by now, I'm skeptical about the material nature of his claims that these civilizations resembled each other because they were doing some giant arc of history related to how much gold and silver they were using, turning and turning in a widening gyre, undoing the actual age nexus between war, bullion, and slavery. I just don't think that holds up. But the idea that all the major world religions and also major world philosophies were about this problem of debt and guilt and money and authority, and that each major global region had a response to that involved both institutions of faith and governance, that's very convincing. Graeber also uses this to explain what a symbol is and how the very nature of symbols comes from debt. At the end of this chapter, you're going to have to read that for yourself. I didn't have time to cover it, and frankly, I'm not even sure really what he was up to there. To put it another way, maybe I just couldn't quite understand it. So for my purposes, what this chapter is about, chapter 10 of Debt, is the way that the different successor civilizations, the Caliphate as the successor to Rome, the Han Dynasty as the successor to the Qin Dynasty, and the warring kingdoms of India who succeeded Ashoka's Mauryan Empire, how these three different civilizations dealt with what Graeber calls the merging, quote, of complementary ideals of commodity markets and universal world religions. This makes Graeber's theory that the Middle Ages were the same everywhere really work. Not that they were the same, because in fact that they were incredibly different, but that each of them dealt with this merging of religion, faith, the ideal, and markets, trade, stuff, physical reality. Here's a quick aside about how this combination is still working in today's thinking. If you've listened to this series for a while, I'm sure you've heard me reference John Maynard Keynes's economic possibilities for our grandchildren. Graeber and Cory Doctorow both reference it frequently. Keynes wrote about 100 years ago that in 100 years we'd have so much money that we wouldn't really have to work. And his prediction about how rich we are came true, at least in the United States, and yet work is a more important part of our lives than ever. Like I said, it's an interesting article. We'll talk about it more later, and I've talked about it before. The important part for me is that Keynes claims two things are going to make all of our wealth. One of them is science, which seems to me acceptable. Our agriculture is more efficient, our buildings are more stable, our heating is easier. All these things that make up our quality of life or standard of living are the products of technological innovations. We can use the word science for that. But the other thing Keynes praises is, quote, compound interest. Here's one quote. The power of compound interest over 200 years is such as to stagger the imagination. Here's another quote where Keynes combines it with science. Thus, for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his real, his permanent problem. How to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him to live wisely and agreeably and well. This to me is baffling. How can compound interest raise your standard of living the same way science can? Even Keynes, who, as Graeber puts it, fully accepted that banks do indeed create money out of thin air, seems to think that when you have more money, you also have a higher standard of living. But compound interest, since it creates money out of thin air, it's not creating higher standard of living. You can teach a student to do compound interest calculations. I had to do them in math class, I don't know, middle school maybe? But just calculating that your money will be much more valuable in 200 years doesn't mean anything. It has to be connected somehow to that other thing, the innovation, production, what Keynes calls science. But Keynes doesn't explain that they are connected, and that's bothered me since I first read this piece. He seems happy to say that 1 pound can become 2 million pounds after 200 years, and that's great, and that means nothing, because that's just math. I can say 100 times 100 is 10,000. Did I do that math right? But it doesn't mean that we got more money. We just did some math. The Middle Ages, according to Graeber, is the era in which people decided that something as insubstantial and intellectual as math, and that two solid world of flesh and bone and dirt and markets are linked in some permanent way, so powerfully linked that it's unthinkable to unlink them. That's why it doesn't even occur to Keynes that compound interest might not be linked to a higher standard of living. Never again can a Confucian even think to say that benevolence and righteousness are separate from profit. Once the Confucian is a bureaucrat in charge of a grain harvest, benevolence and profit are the same thing. Or, as Graeber puts it in chapter 9, spiritualism is built on a bedrock of materialism. And Graeber's Middle Ages is the story of the way that these were always linked, even though how they were linked in the different civilizations is very, very different. Back to chapter 9. I rushed through the history in chapter 9, and I'm going to rush through the history in chapter 10 even more to get the ideas. But let me give you Graeber's setup of where things stand at the end of the actual age with respect to rulers and their attitudes towards these beliefs. Rulers' attitudes changed over time. At first, most appear to have affected an attitude of bemused tolerance toward the new philosophical and religious movements, while privately embracing some version of cynical realpolitik. But as warring cities and principalities were replaced by great empires, and especially as those empires began to reach the limits of their expansion, sending the military coinage slavery complex into crisis, all this suddenly changed. In India, Ashoka tried to refound his kingdom on Buddhism. In Rome, Constantine turned to the Christians. In China, the Han Emperor Wu Ti, faced with a similar military and financial crisis, adopted Confucianism as the philosophy of state. Of the three, only Wu Ti was ultimately successful. The Chinese Empire endured, in one form or another, for 2,000 years, almost always with Confucianism as its official ideology. In Constantine's case, the Western Empire fell apart, but the Roman Church endured. Ashoka's project could be said to be the least successful. Not only did his empire fall apart, replaced by an endless series of weaker, usually fragmentary kingdoms, but Buddhism itself was largely driven out of his one-time territories, though it did establish itself much more firmly in China, Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Korea, Japan, and much of Southeast Asia. Okay, so one thing that we can say now that we're talking about this quote is that my mapping of the Graeber's Middle Ages as China, the Caliphate, and India doesn't line up. India doesn't exist as a polity, and the Caliphate isn't the direct successor to Rome. That's either the Catholic Church or Byzantium, but that just means it's more complicated than how I made it seem. We're going to talk now about Buddhism, which again is more complicated because Buddhism is the Indian philosophy, but it leaves China and is succeeded by Hinduism, and Graeber talks about Hinduism, but more about Buddhism. Anyway, we'll do Buddhism, then get to China and Confucianism, and then conclude with Islam and the Caliphate, which is totally different from China, and yet also, as we said, about the merging of commodity markets and world religions, or spiritualism on the bedrock of materialism. Let's start with Buddhism and the inexhaustible treasuries. This is the one that makes sense of how Keynes viewed compound interest. First, here's the historical context from Graeber. The Mauryans represented a high watermark of empire. The next 500 years saw a succession of kingdoms, most of them strongly supportive of Buddhism. Stupas and monasteries sprang up everywhere, but the states that sponsored them grew weaker and weaker. Centralized armies dissolved. Soldiers, like officials, increasingly came to be paid by land grants rather than salaries. As a result, the number of coins in circulation steadily declined. Here, too, the early Middle Ages witnessed a dramatic decline of cities, where the Greek ambassador Megasthenes described Ashoka's capital of Patna as the largest city in the world of his day. Medieval Arab and Chinese travelers described India as a land of endless tiny villages. That's the end of the quote, and the point is, although the ideas of Buddhism are totally different from those of Christianity in Western Europe, we still get our classic Middle Ages idea of monasteries, farmers, and kingdoms, not centralized empires with massive amounts of bullion. And just like with the European monasteries, the money is in the Buddhist temples. And the money comes from, according to Graeber, this remarkable phenomenon of interest. Here's the quote. One need only consider how the Buddhist establishments popping up all over India during these centuries were funded. While the earliest monks were wandering mendicants, owning little more than their begging bowls, early medieval monasteries were often magnificent establishments with vast treasuries. Still, in principle, Their operations were financed almost entirely through credit. The key innovation was the creation of what were called perpetual endowments, or inexhaustible treasuries. Say, a lay supporter wished to make a contribution to her local monastery. Rather than offering to provide candles for a specific ritual or servants to attend to the upkeep of the monastic grounds, she would provide a certain sum of money, or something worth a great deal of money, that would then be loaned out in the name of the monastery at the accepted 15% annual rate. The interest on the loan would then be earmarked for that specific purpose. An inscription discovered at the great monastery of Sansi sometime around 450 AD provides a handy illustration. A woman named Harsfamini donates the relatively modest sum of 12 dinar to the noble community of monks. The text carefully inscribes how the income is to be divided up. The interest of 5 of the dinars was to provide daily meals for 5 different monks. The interest from another 3 would pay to light 3 lamps for Buddha in memory of her parents, and so forth. The inscription ends by saying that this was a permanent endowment created with a document in stone to last as long as the moon and the sun. Since the principle would never be touched, the contribution would last forever. All right, that's the end of this quote. Graeber is really interested in how this relates to gold, and he tells the story of how the gold ends up in the temples in forms of statues and altars, and then the rulers want that gold back. That's nowhere near as interesting to me, though, as this idea of the inexhaustible treasury. This is real money that becomes imaginary money, this interest, and then this imaginary money is doing things in the real world. As Graeber puts it, we have to assume that in most cases the money is an accounting unit. What were really being transacted were animals, wheat, silk, butter, fruit, and all the other goods whose appropriate rates of interest were so carefully stipulated in the law codes of the time. All right, end of that quote. But through the magic of interest, a little bit of gold can feed monks forever. Forever. This is that spiritualism/materialism thing that I've identified in Keynes as well. The power of compound interest means that 1 lump of gold can light 3 lamps per day forever. I see this all the time at universities. The modern day monasteries, your monasteries in 2024, well, those are universities. And when the debt crisis hit in 2008, and remember that crisis was the inspiration for Graeber's book, I learned how weird debt is when I saw that a lot of people got laid off at UNC, where I was a grad student at the time. My wife worked at Duke, and I just assumed that Duke would hire all of these fantastic workers who were laid off at UNC. But Duke, although its workers did suffer a lot less than those at UNC, it didn't go on a big hiring binge of people who have been laid off, even though it could have, snatched up a bunch of distressed assets, aka workers who needed new jobs but were good at their jobs. Even though Duke had literally billions of dollars in their endowment that they weren't spending. But I understand now, through Graeber, that Duke, like all other big-time universities, is working off the inexhaustible treasury model. If they spent a few million hiring new workers, and those workers made the university lots of money, they could top up the endowment and come out ahead. That's how we think of capitalism working. But to spend some of that endowment money is to suggest that money is on its commodity side. It's wheat, silk, butter, fruit. If you never spend it, if you just leave it there and depend on the interest, it's more like the spiritual side of money, endlessly, magically making more and more value. So your grandchildren don't have to work if you're Keynes, or you can always pay your tenured faculty members if you're Duke. Let me try and make sense of this in terms of the metaphysics. Duke and Harvard and the Gates Foundation and every other highly endowed nonprofit believes that they can look up right now exactly how much revenue they will have in 3017 AD or 10,017 AD for that matter. All they got to do is figure out the rate of interest and crunch the numbers, and yeah, it'll need to be converted into future dollars, but for now, they know. It's literally laying up treasures that cannot be touched in heaven or the future. And I thought I'd read for you guys Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to 21, for those of you who want to see how this works in Christianity. Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. There will your heart be also. That's why charities are so infuriating. Their heart is in their inexhaustible treasuries. I mean, the modern day version of this would be like, spend not your money on food and shelter for people, but rather lay it up in compound interest where neither moth nor rust do corrupt. All right, now, pulling myself back away from Christianity, finishing up with India, Graeber says that the Middle Ages in India led to the creation of the Indian village, which was so beloved by Gandhi, which was wonderfully self-sufficient and anti-imperialist and didn't need coins, but was also, and lots of people have criticized Gandhi on this part for leaving this out, these villages had the formation of debt, peonage, and this rigid and brutal caste system that really made it hierarchical and unpleasant. I can't speak to the accuracy of this description of medieval India. I've heard from multiple people after the Gandhi episode that really was how the Indian village worked out, and Gandhi sadly romanticized it. Graeber seems to agree with that as well. And if you want more detail and to follow the sources, of course, that's all in the chapter. All right, we can leave India now because Graeber's not anywhere near as interested in India in this chapter as he is in China and Islam. Let's go on to China. Here's Graeber. By medieval standards, India was unusual for resisting the appeal of the great axial age religions, but we observed the basic pattern: the decline of empire, armies, and cash economy, and the rise of religious authorities, independent of the state, who win much of their popular legitimacy through their ability to regulate emerging credit systems. So, that's Graeber's quote about India. What does he say about China? China might be said to represent the opposite extreme. This was the one place where a late axial age attempt to yoke empire and religion together was a complete success. True, here as elsewhere there was an initial period of breakdown. After the collapse of the Han Dynasty around 220 AD, the central state broke apart, cities shrank, coins disappeared, and so on. But in China this was only temporary. As Max Weber long ago pointed out, once one sets up a genuinely effective bureaucracy, it's almost impossible to get rid of it. And the Chinese bureaucracy was uniquely effective. Before long, the old Han system re-emerged, a centralized state run by Confucian scholar gentry trained in the literary classics, selected through a national exam system, working in meticulously organized national and regional bureaus where the money supply, like other economic matters, was continually monitored and regulated. That's really not the end of the quote. I just need to take a breather. We can see that what we've got is, according to Graeber, a Chinese empire that keeps falling apart, but always being put together in roughly the same way with the same idea. These scholar bureaucrats whose job it is to make the economy work for everyone. Why does the empire keep falling apart? Here's what Graeber says. The two great threats to the authorities were always the same: the nomadic peoples to the north, who they systematically bribed, but who nonetheless periodically swept over and conquered sections of China, and popular unrest and rebellion. The latter was almost constant, and on a scale unknown anywhere else in human history. There were decades in Chinese history when the rate of recorded peasant uprisings was roughly 1.8 per hour. What's more, such uprisings were frequently successful. Most of the most famous Chinese dynasties that were not the product of barbarian invasion, the Yuan or the Qing, were originally peasant insurrections: the Han, Tang, Sung, and Ming. In no other part of the world do we see anything like this. As a result, Chinese statecraft ultimately came down to funneling enough resources to the cities to feed the urban population and keep the nomads at bay, without causing a notoriously contumacious rural population to rise up in arms. The official Confucian ideology of patriarchal authority, equal opportunity, promotion of agriculture, light taxes, and careful government control of merchants seemed expressly designed to appeal to the interests and sensibilities of a potentially rebellious rural patriarch. All right, that's the end of the quote, or really I'm just taking another breather. So this is the plan to give the nomads to the north and the angry peasants what they want. You can see how democratic, everyday anarchist this is in the way that I've tried to emphasize in my episode with Anthony Caldelis about Byzantium or the Eastern Roman Empire, a system that looks totally hierarchical and dominated by elite Confucian bureaucrats is really being run to make sure the people who can rise up, which is the people, although admittedly the patriarchal people, the men, is being run to make sure they have what they need so they don't rebel. This is similar to what we talked about with Athens with John Weisweiler as well. All right, so here's the pattern for when the system does break down, according to Graeber. Widespread inequality and unrest, followed by the appointment of official commissions of inquiry, regional debt relief, cheap grain loans, famine relief, laws against the selling of children, all this became the standard fare of government policy. It was very unevenly successful. It certainly did not create an egalitarian peasant utopia, but it prevented any widespread return to axial age conditions. Jumping in here, it seems obvious that what he's talking about is something very similar to what FDR did with the New Deal, or things like student debt relief under the Biden administration that keeps getting blocked. And these things keep getting blocked because we've got this idea that, surely one must pay their debts. We're going all the way back to the beginning of the book here. But what Graeber is telling us is that something like China has worked the same way, roughly, as the national government of the United States did in the 20th century, at least until the neoliberal turn. Keep the system working, keep it working for everyone. When things get out of hand and you've got armies of the unemployed marching on the capital, which happens, of course, in these Chinese uprisings that Graeber's talking about, but also happened during the Great Depression. When the armies march, you institute government policies that give people what they want. Here's more from Graeber. We are used to thinking of such bureaucratic interventions, particularly the monopolies and regulations, as state restrictions on, quote, the market, owing to the prevailing prejudice that sees markets as quasi-natural phenomena that emerge by themselves, and governments as having no role other than to squelch or siphon from them. I have repeatedly pointed out how mistaken this is, but China provides a particularly striking example. The Confucian state may have been the world's greatest and most enduring bureaucracy, but it actively promoted markets, and as a result, commercial life in China soon became far more sophisticated and markets more developed than anywhere else in the world. All right, the market and the state. Again, this is almost at the very beginning of the book. The market and the state are always connected. And really, people who love, quote, the market are probably not actually very fond of markets, i.e. the places, lots of places where people can buy the stuff they need. Confucianism is, in fact, according to Graeber, totally against, quote, the market. The market essentially means the stock market, the buying of selling of debt, everything that would happen in a Manhattan investment bank, and precisely what you wouldn't get in a local community bank. Here's Graeber talking about the support of the markets. This despite the fact that the Confucian orthodoxy was overtly hostile to merchants and even the profit motive itself. Commercial profit was seen as legitimate only as compensation for the labor that merchants expended in transporting goods from one place to another, but never as fruits of speculation. What this meant in practice was that they were pro-market but anti-capitalist. So what Graeber is saying is that markets, places where you exchange stuff with your neighbors, are great. Confucianism wasn't against them. What they were against was having money purely for the purposes of making money, which Graeber is calling anti-capitalism. Return to the book. Again, this seems bizarre, since we're used to assuming that capitalism and markets are the same thing. But as the great French historian Fernand Braudel pointed out, in many ways they could equally well be conceived of as opposites. While markets are ways of exchanging goods through the medium of money, historically, ways for those with a surplus of grain to acquire candles and vice versa. In economic shorthand, CMC, for commodity to money to other commodity. Capitalism is first and foremost the art of using money to get more money. MCM prime. Money to commodity to money prime, or profit. Normally, the easiest way to do this is by establishing some kind of formal or de facto monopoly. For this reason, capitalists, whether merchant princes, financiers, or industrialists, inevitably try to ally themselves with political authorities to limit the freedom of the market, so as to make it easier for them to do so. From this perspective, China was for most of its history the ultimate anti-capitalist market state. Breaking in here, Graeber's totally convinced me that China was an anti-capitalist market state. These terms are, according to 20th century orthodoxy, impossible, but it makes sense. All right, resuming the quote. Unlike later European princes, Chinese rulers systematically refused to team up with would-be Chinese capitalists, who always existed. Instead, like their officials, they saw them as destructive parasites, though, unlike the usurers, ones whose fundamentally selfish and antisocial motivations could still be put to use in certain ways. In Confucian terms, merchants were like soldiers. As individuals, they were not good people, but they were also necessary to defend the frontiers. Similarly, merchants were driven by greed and basically immoral, but they could be made to serve the public good. Whatever one might think of the principles, the results are hard to deny. For most of its history, China maintained the highest standard of living in the world. So I know that was a big, long quote. The only thing I think you need to know is there's this Confucian description of different kinds of people. The medieval Christian one has 3 different kinds of people: soldiers, priests, and peasants. Some fight, some pray, others farm. And in the Confucian version, the soldiers and merchants are often linked together and often near the bottom. There's usually 4, but different Confucian scholars had different versions, and some of them weren't hierarchical, but whether the merchants and the warriors are together or at the bottom, let's be clear, neither of them ever are at the top the way the knights were in Europe or samurai were in Japan. And to continue my other thought, Graeber is again messing with our sense of what belongs where to suggest that the Chinese government is basically running what we would call social democracy if it was happening in 1937. The market ran so that people could get stuff. Stuff was turned into money so it could be turned into stuff. Commodity for money for other commodity. And the Confucian bureaucrats ran this system so that the poor peasants and the potential warlords both felt like they had enough stuff and didn't need to overthrow the government, which was no peasant utopia, but was more or less for the common good. And the threat was money for commodity for money prime, the use of money to make more money. That's capitalism, and it's anti-market. You can really only run it, A, if you have some sort of monopoly, and B, if someone can't just set up a shop somewhere selling the stuff people need. This bad thing is neoliberalism, and Graeber is telling us that neoliberalism is thousands of years old, and the Chinese system has had checks on it for thousands of years. Except according to Graeber, eventually those inexhaustible treasuries in the Buddhist temples in China got too big, and they became too wealthy and powerful, and the government had to smash them. Graeber spends a lot of time on this, and I'm not going to. This chapter is so long. It's like longer than the 3 previous chapters combined, but that's the dynamic, and it's the same as when Henry VIII went after the monasteries. But Henry did that 1,000 or more years later because the Middle Ages reached Europe so much later than they reached China, using Graeber's definition of the Middle Ages. All right, now we've got to do one last uniting of spiritualism and materialism, and that's Islam. Graeber calls this the Near West in one of his delightful iconoclasms. We in the United States tend to call it, the Middle East or the Near East, and we call Europe the West, which makes no sense because Europe is east of us, and it's Japan and China that are west of us. That term Middle East is just a term you would use if you assume that Europe is the normal place. Say, Italy is where things are, and then that makes Spain and England the West, and that makes Baghdad the East. The term Middle East, it's Eurocentrism. But in the Middle Ages, the center of the Mediterranean power moved east to the Caliphate. So if the big civilizations are the Caliphate, India, and China, then the Caliphate is the West, the near West, and then, the thing that we call Europe is the far West. Here's Graeber. For most of the Middle Ages, the economic nerve center of the world economy and the source of its most dramatic financial innovations was neither China nor India, but the West, which from the perspective of the rest of the world meant the world of Islam. It's easy to forget that from the perspective of any other great tradition, the difference between Christianity and Islam is almost negligible. One need only pick up a book on, say, medieval Islamic philosophy to discover disputes between the Baghdad Aristotelians and the Neo-Pythagoreans in Basra, or the Persian Neoplatonists. Essentially, scholars doing the same work of trying to square the revealed religious tradition beginning with Abraham and Moses with the categories of Greek philosophy, and doing so in a larger context of mercantile capitalism, universalistic missionary religion, scientific rationalism, poetic celebrations of romantic love, and periodic waves of fascination with mystical wisdom from the East. All right. I think Graeber's absolutely right. That's totally convincing of how we should think of, not a Judeo-Christian civilization, but a Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization that for most of the past 2,000 years was centered in, quote, the Near West, the Islamic part of this grander civilization. Again, I say this is delightfully iconoclastic because people like to define Islam as incompatible with the West, and Graeber is arguing that for most of the history of the West, it was the barbarian northerners who were incompatible with the great Judeo-Islamico-Christian civilization. All right, so what was this Islamic, aka Western, solution to the question of how spiritualism and materialism are related? According to Graeber, it's best understood as a reversal of China's. Prevailing Islamic attitude toward law, government, and economic matters was the exact opposite of that prevalent in China. Confucians were suspicious of governance through strict codes of law, preferring to rely on the inherent sense of justice of the cultivated scholar, a scholar who was simply assumed to also be a government official. Medieval Islam, on the other hand, enthusiastically embraced law, which was seen as a religious institution derived from the Prophet, but tended to view government, more often than not, as an unfortunate necessity, an institution that the truly pious would do better to avoid. In part, this was because of the peculiar nature of Islamic government. The Arab military leaders who, after Muhammad's death in 632 AD, conquered the Sasanian Empire and established the Abbasid Caliphate, always continued to see themselves as people of the desert, and never felt entirely part of the urban civilizations they had come to rule. This discomfort was never quite overcome, on either side. It took the bulk of the population several centuries to convert to the conqueror's religion, and even when they did, they never seemed to have really identified with their rulers. Government was seen as military power, perhaps necessary to defend the faith, but fundamentally exterior to society. In part, too, it was because of the peculiar alliance between merchants and common folk that came to be aligned against them. After Caliph al-Ma'mun's abortive attempt to set up a theocracy in 832 AD, the government took a hands-off position on questions of religion. The various schools of Islamic law were free to create their own educational institutions and maintain their own separate system of religious justice. Crucially, it was the ulama, the legal scholars, who were the principal agents in the conversion of the bulk of the empire's population to Islam in Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa in those same years. But the elders in charge of guilds, civic associations, and religious brotherhoods, they did their best to keep the government with its armies and ostentation at arm's length. All right, end of that bit of the quote. Again, this is the opposite of China. The government official and the legal scholar is the same person in China. In the Caliphate, the scholar is supposed to be totally separate from the government. And according to Graeber, the Confucian governor-scholar tries to be united with the people, with the military and the merchants as a necessary evil. In Islam, it's the merchants who are on the side of the people, with the government and the military as the necessary evil. Back to Graeber. This disjuncture had profound economic effects. It meant that the Caliphate and later Muslim empires could operate in many ways much like the old Axial Age empires, creating professional armies, waging wars of conquest, capturing slaves, melting down loot, and distributing it in the form of coins to soldiers and officials, demanding that those coins be rendered back as taxes, but at the same time without having nearly the same effect on ordinary people's lives. We can perhaps speak of a kind of military coinage slavery complex here, but it existed in a kind of bubble. Wars of expansion and trade with Europe and Africa did produce a fairly constant flow of slaves, but in dramatic contrast to the ancient world, very few of them ended up laboring in farms or workshops. Most ended up as decoration in the houses of the rich, or increasingly over time as soldiers. Over the course of the Abbasid dynasty, from 750 to 1258 AD, in fact, the empire came to rely for its military forces almost exclusively on Mamluks, highly trained military slaves captured or purchased from the Turkish steppes. The policy of employing slaves as soldiers was maintained by all of the Islamic successor states, including the Mughals, and culminated in the famous Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt in the 13th century. But historically, it was unprecedented. In most times and places, slaves are, for obvious reasons, the very last people to be allowed near weapons. Here it was systematic. But in a strange way, it also made perfect sense. If slaves are by definition people who have been severed from society, this was the logical consequence of the wall created between society and the medieval Islamic state. All right. So if the Caliphate and the Mamluks were a sort of bubble within Islamic society, a miniature and almost separate military, industrial, coinage, slavery complex, the real leaders and heroes were the scholars and, uniquely it seems in Islam, the merchants. Here's Graeber. It was possible because from the beginning, Islam had a positive view towards commerce. Muhammad himself had begun his adult life as a merchant, and no Islamic thinker ever treated the honest pursuit of profit as itself intrinsically immoral or inimical to faith. Neither did the prohibitions against usury, which for the most part were scrupulously enforced even in the case of commercial loans, in any sense mitigate against the growth of commerce or even the development of complex credit instruments. To the contrary, the early centuries of the Caliphate saw an immediate efflorescence in both. Profits were still possible because Islamic jurists were careful to allow for certain service fees and other considerations, notably allowing goods bought on credit to be priced slightly higher than those bought for cash, that ensured that bankers and traders still had an incentive to provide credit services. Still, these incentives were never enough to allow banking to become a full-time occupation. Instead, almost any merchant operating on a sufficiently large scale could be expected to combine banking with a host of other money-making activities. As a result, credit instruments soon became so essential to trade that almost anyone of prominence was expected to keep most of his or her wealth on deposit and to make everyday transactions, not by counting out coins, but by inkpot and paper. Now, as Graeber points out, this commodity money, commodity way of doing things is what Adam Smith wanted capitalism to be. In fact, Graeber suggests that Adam Smith stole these ideas from the Persians. Smith's description of how the world should be run was really just accepting the way that things were done in the Islamic world during the Middle Ages. The big innovation of the Italian cities in the Renaissance was using paper instead of coins. Well, they were already doing that in the Islamic world. And Adam Smith's view was that partnerships should be rewarded with profit based on taking risk, as opposed to our current way of doing things, where if you have money, you can turn it into a commodity and then more money without having any risk. Which again is just Smith affirming how Islamic society did things. Here's more Graeber. When it came to finance, instead of interest-bearing investments, the preferred approach was partnerships, where often one party would supply the capital, the other carry out the enterprise. Instead of a fixed return, the investor would receive a share of the profits. Even labor arrangements were often organized on a profit-sharing basis. In all such matters, reputation was crucial. In fact, one lively debate in early commercial law was over the question of whether reputation could, like land, labor, money, or other resources, itself be considered a form of capital. It sometimes happened that merchants could form partnerships with no capital at all, but only their good names. It was called the partnership of good reputation. So, in this society, according to Graeber, the heroes of honor are not knights or bureaucrats, but merchants. More Graeber. In Islamic society, the merchant became not just a respected figure, but a kind of paragon, like the warrior, a man of honor able to pursue far-flung adventures. Unlike him, able to do so in a fashion damaging no one. The French historian Maurice Lombard draws a striking, if perhaps idolized picture of him, quote, in his stately townhouse, surrounded by slaves and hangers-on, in the midst of his collections of books, travel souvenirs, and rare ornaments. Along with his ledgers, correspondence, and letters of credit, skilled in the arts of double-entry bookkeeping, along with secret codes and ciphers, giving alms to the poor, supporting places of worship, perhaps dedicating himself to the writing of poetry, while still able to translate his general creditworthiness into great capital reserves by appealing to family and partners. Lombard's picture is to some degree inspired by the famous 1001 Nights description of Sinbad, who, having spent his youth in perilous mercantile ventures to faraway lands, finally retired, rich beyond dreams, to spend the rest of his life amidst gardens and dancing girls, telling tall tales of his adventures. All right. Graeber even goes on to say that the medieval questing knight of Europe, your Gawain or your Lancelot, seems to have actually been an image of an Islamic merchant transferred into a Christian context. This was the Middle Ages in the West, in the Judeo-Christian Islamic world, merchant adventurers. Venetian traders and Adam Smith's capitalism were just Christendom catching up to the Islamic world. Almost done with this long episode. One big thing to leave you with. This takes us back to the inexhaustible treasuries and university endowments. The big invention that Christendom does make, according to Graeber, and this is the source of so much of our current troubles, is the corporation. I'll remind all would-be capitalists again that Adam Smith was against corporations. The corporation is a bizarre combination of the merchant, who was really a person, a very real person with honor on the line, and the inexhaustible treasury, which is actually a spiritual being. These two things, when combined, create a monster, an inexhaustible treasury that can never be killed or reasoned with because it's immortal and eternal, and who doesn't have to maintain a good name, who is out buying and selling things to make money. So, to sum up everything, here's Graeber comparing China and Islamic civilization again. The striking thing is that the Confucian condemnation of the merchant and the Islamic celebration of the merchant ultimately led to the same thing, prosperous societies with flourishing markets, but where the elements never came together to create the great merchant banks and industrial firms that were to become the hallmark of modern capitalism. Where did that monster come from? This is me, not Graeber. Well, it was the Christian world that made that eternal corporation. Back to Graeber. We are used to assuming that there's something natural or inevitable about the existence of corporations. In historical terms, they are actually strange, exotic creatures. No other great tradition came up with anything like it. They are the most peculiarly European addition to that endless proliferation of metaphysical entities so characteristic of the Middle Ages, as well as the most enduring. They have, of course, changed a great deal over time. Medieval corporations owned property, and they often engaged in complex financial arrangements. But in no case were they profit-seeking enterprises in the modern sense. The ones that came closest were, perhaps unsurprisingly, monastic orders. Above all, the Cistercians, whose monasteries became something like the Chinese Buddhist ones, surrounded by mills and smithies, practicing rationalized commercial agriculture with a workforce of lay brothers who were effectively wage laborers spinning and exporting wool. Some even talk about monastic capitalism. Still, the ground was only really prepared for capitalism in the familiar sense of the term when the merchants began to organize themselves into eternal bodies as a way to win monopolies, legal or de facto, and avoid the ordinary risks of trade. All right, that's it for this chapter, this long chapter. I left so much out. We'll put some of it back in with the conversation with Eleanor Janega. I hope you enjoy that. Remember, you can reach out to me at everydayanarchismpodcast@gmail.com. I'm still behind on emails, but I hope to get to them soon. You can help the show out by leaving reviews on Spotify or Apple, by giving financially at everydayanarchism.com. And as always, thank you to everyone who has given. I also want to thank my editors and say that the music, which you're about to hear, is by David Hill.